Hello, everybody. It is day 14 of the quarantine. Alright, so I'm just going to go right out and say that this chapter just shit on me. I have no clue, what's going on. In a lot of different sections, but I'm going to do my best to glaze over all of it and hit all the important stuff so that you guys don't vote me off the island. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by reading the last two paragraphs in the entire section, just because I think that the last two paragraphs literally, they cover the entire section. He gets very, very nitpicky with a lot of details in this section, and it can be very, very overwhelming and confusing, especially if we haven't read the two chapters prior to this. And so let's just kick it off. The conclusion on page 186, he starts by saying the instrumentalization theory is intended to open up the imagination to a possible transformation of industrial society. It does so by showing how the causal determinations of technical systems are contingent on culturally specific notions of well-being. The theory provides an alternative to technocratic rationalism by showing the rationality of public intervention into the technosystem. It goes beyond theoretical critique to show the role of social struggle and political agency in socio-technical development. The instrumentalization theory is politically significant not because it advocates or supports any particular policy, but because it makes politics thinkable in a world of the technosystem. In the absence of a theory supporting a social understanding of the technosystem, technocracy beckons. Philosophy of technology is called to challenge this conclusion with an account of the co-production of society and technology in the making of worlds. The struggle over the technosystem is the gestalt switch in the structure of modernity. So let's go back to the very beginning now. Now that we've kind of glossed over everything that he went through in that section, I'm just going to go section by section and talk about what I understood. So when we start with the introduction, he basically talks about how he opens up and says the chapter addresses the logic of public intervention into the technosystem in terms of rhetorical theory. Basically, what he's saying is that we're finding the actual rationality of protest. And so way back in our class, remember when Dr. Hentrup talked about how the first generation critical theorists and how badass they are, and they are badass. I feel like Feenberg kind of goes over the same thing here, where he says that because of the advances in today's society, we're able to reevaluate the things that these first generation critical theorists like Marcuse and Horkheimer and Adorno were talking about. And so let's kick off doing that. So he talks about Marcuse specifically, and he says he was way ahead of his time because people ignored him, but people ignored him because he did not give a concrete politics of technology, which he couldn't have done that at the time because there wasn't really any environmentalist forming or anything like that. And so that brings us to this idea of instrumentalization, which is is a very, very big topic, and he goes over it in the previous chapter. And so if the first half of this didn't make sense to you like it didn't to me, that's okay. So instrumentalization rationality, which is the way that he first applies it in the section is by saying that it's based on the normative character of rationality, just like the two-dimensional ontology. And so through this understanding of it, instrumentalization is super, super complex, but also simple in a sense, because he gives a lot of different charts and stuff. Instrumentalization is the connection of causal relations and normative relations. And so, but I'll get to that. So the goal of the instrumentalization is to elaborate the theory further to account for public engagement in processes of redesign specifically, which is important because that's an aspect of instrumentalization, of artifacts and institutions. To change the design process, public protests must dialogue with the experts, which we know. Also, they must stay within what Kant called the public reason in the context of the technosystem. So constructivism plus instrumentalization has already been a tool for kind of overcoming the negativity, the eschatology, if I'm pronouncing that right, that he calls it. So we move to the positive, the contingency of technosystem, which kind of like got me hung up, but anyways. The social contingency implies a gray area or multiple right answers to technical questions, which are usually black and white. So, like, I'll get back to that. Technical judgments become both subjective and objective. Kant of reflective judgments moves the domain of rhetoric and not science. And so this kind of brings us into Kant and his understanding of the role of judgments in the section, which I think is really important because I don't know if you guys can see this. So in this section, like there's two kind of judgments that he talks about, at least for Kant, which is determinate judgments and reflective judgments. Determinate judgments are where the universal law dictates the particulars, and then the reflective judgments are particular laws that lead to generalizations. And so I kind of like made this little, I don't know if you guys can see that, where I kind of like have this idea of the determinate judgments, where it's like, I'm getting all turned around. The rationality, the universal, hands down a determinate judgment to the human, the particular. And he makes this statement where he says that humans, the public, mediates, or it like distinguishes between these two realms. And so humans go to the layperson, and the layperson goes to the expert, and our experience mediates what's passed down. So an experience happens from the original generalization being passed down to us. And then this comes from a reflective judgment. We reflect upon our experience, and then we move from a particular experiential idea of this, and it moves into like this general understanding of like a new creation of rationality. Rationality itself, yeah, which is good. So where do we go from here? So then he talks about the frenetic background, kind of like touches on it. And the frenetic background is really, really important to us because it is essentially like, it's not the cultural background, but it's like the underlying aspects that and assumptions that exist within that cultural context. But we'll get back to that. So then we talk about this person, Arndt. She argues that like judgments of beauty, political judgments, yada, yada, yada. So basically the process and the unfolding of how Kant's judgment applies to the real world today, and why we're not stuck in this determinated world, but we're also not ridiculously open to create our own. So it's not particular to a general, and it's also not general to universal. It's both. It's like a circle. It's a big flowing process. And that's why I kind of did that little chart there, is because it helped me understand that it's like we recreate the rationality itself, and then the rationality then creates these systems and these technologies and these markets, and then they affect us. They create an understanding for us, and then it like the system keeps going. And so today, political debate cannot leave the object of debate their own self-sufficiency. So it's like a little objection into this process, is because when we debate something as an object, according to Kant, it's like self-sufficient on its own. But basically what she says is that it's somewhere in between. Like it's not entirely self-sufficient. Like the way that we resolve this is that we suggest that objects of debate are more open than determinate judgments and are more closed than reflective judgments. So it's like it's the circle. So then we move on. He talks about the world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it. So the world of things is we'll talk about, so there's two different domains of public, we'll call it judgments. The the world of things and the affairs which go among men. And the way that he explains how these have kind of developed out of balance is through a resortment back to his substantive and formal bias, and basically just explaining that like we can tell a substantive bias very fast and very cleanly because it's obvious, it's shit. And the formal bias, however, is a lot harder to recognize, one, and it's like we don't know how to react when we understand a system that naturally oppresses us. And so the interesting thing is that the world of things, which we connect to the formal bias, is where the reflective judgments about the universal, in the case of inequality specifically, stands. So people generalize from their experience to change the rationality, and determinate and reflective judgments are able to communicate within the public sphere now. So then we move to this double aspect theory, which this is where I start to get confused, like here to the end. So most of the section. But the double aspect theory is essentially, it starts with a question: in what does the new technical public reason consist? And then he starts to talk about instrumentalization, which is extremely confusing and just super nebulous for me. But from what I understood about instrumentalization, it is the connection, the merging of causal relations and normative relations. It's kind of like a bunching of the two, like not one or the other, but the two of them. And so when we talk about double aspect theory, we're talking about this question and how these two things exist together, not opposed to each other. And so he goes into the causal, the cultural functionalizations are brought together in the design process through rational operations. So it's basically just a general gloss over how these two things can exist with one another. And so I'm going to read a little paragraph, and I got to get moving because I'm already 12 minutes in. The rational operations connecting causal and cultural levels have the double aspects of technical relevance and normativity. For example, the technically rational operation in which a tree is cut down for lumber releases its resource potential by removing it from its natural setting. This is abstraction in the material form. The tree is constituted as lumber, a functional artifact, in accordance with the legal and cultural meaning of lumber in forestry and construction, and is endowed with the quality of usefulness for which it can be judged more or less suitable for a particular work. The outcome of the operation exhibits both technical and normative aspects, and these are intrinsic to the object, not externally related things magically joined like the Cartesian mind to body through some sort of technical pineal gland. And so it basically just goes into more and more detail about how these rational operations, they exist with one another in this process. And so through this process, where they exist with one another, we start to talk about the common world. So we're going to move into the next section. The common world is where actors with different relations to technicism can communicate. And so it's like, how do they communicate? Like, how is that even possible? And the answer would be like, through this process in which we're both divided but connected through the technological processes and systems that surround us. And so it's like, right now we're being mediated by the screen, right? So we're separated, but at the same time we're being connected. And so if there's something that inherently establishes an oppression through this technology, through this video chat, it's going to cause an experience for you. Like if I turn the video up and you're like naturally looking down at me, and it's like now you feel this inherent oppression through the technology that we're experiencing, then you're going to have an experience through that, and then it's going to react, and you're going to push back and reform and create a reflective judgment. And so with this being the background, now we get into like the specific stuff, which I'm not going to go into detail on because I'm already at 15 minutes and I really don't fucking know what he's talking about throughout this section. So the structure of the debate that we move into, is like these four things that we basically get pointed out is institutional rules and procedures, a multiplicity of values and interests, principles of justice, a phonetic coding with paradigms of articulation and significance. So under the typical model that we live in modernity, people like John Rawls, yada yada, they are very, very focused on developing like normative practices in the sense of like relativity and like who does what where, but none of them understand that everything that has developed, even value-wise, and rules and procedures and justice, all form under pretenses of this frenetic coding, which develops in tandem with the techno system. And so essentially what he's saying is that these can't be pulled apart in the common world. They need to be realized as two parts of a whole. And so then we get into the technical topologies. I'm not going to go over that because I'm sure that Dr. Hentrop is going to do a much, much finer job. But I'll just gloss over like look at the table. The table confused the shit out of me, but maybe it'll make sense to you. So like just very, very quickly, what I understood was that abstraction, provision, obligation, and then translation, layers, values, feedback, effects, responsibility. It's a continuum. The way that I understood it is that it moves from this abstraction process of the technology into the translation, the layers and the values, the incorporation of what it means in the frenetic context to us, and then the feedback of those technological systems back into society. It's the circle once again. And so then we move on to the rhetoric itself of the techno system, which is in the public subjugated knowledges, as they like to call it, which is the understandings of subordinate groups in modern social institutions, which splits it into two different things: strategies and tactics. And essentially, it's talking about how like we're operating under the pretenses, I think, of more tactically. So rhetoric defies logic and the logic of strategic knowledge to make the weaker position seem the stronger. So it's a punctual and disorganized sense of communication in which we are now able to not undermine, but recreate the system that we exist in. And so under all of these pretenses, this is how the political and the logic of protest develops, is that we live in the system, we operate under these conditions, we recreate these conditions, we experience these conditions, and then recreate these conditions. And then create new universals for us to live under. And so, yeah, and that brings me to the last two paragraphs that kind of underwent all this. You guys are great. Thanks for watching. If you made it through all 18 minutes of me babbling, power to you. Peace out.